Atoms, ions, chemical bonds, and how it relates to the human anatomy and human physiology. So this is a quick recap review back in Gen Chem, and we'll start off with a little bit on atoms. Atoms represents the foundation of the universal elements of our world. Some of them are also more prevalent in the biology of an organism. Inside the atom, you have a nucleus that contains this proton and a neutron, and that's where a majority of the weight of that element comes from. And surrounding it, there's this electron that has a probability of showing up in a certain orbit. The electron provides the ability for these elements to interact and therefore create bonds. That's why at a molecular level, all of our physiological processes is based on these electrons that you can't see, right? They're just way too small, much smaller than our light microscope can detect. The atomic mass is the proton and neutrons, and that's the weight, and we call that an AMU for short, atomic mass unit. And the atomic number is equal to the number of protons of an element. And you probably have seen a periodic table in most science labs or biology lab, and that's just a quick guideline that shows you that as you move from one end, the left side of the periodic table, to the right side, there is a change in the number of electrons surrounding the outer cloud. So we'll talk a little bit about how bonding works and talk a little bit about bonds in a second. Hydrogen has one proton, one electron, and the cartoon image shows you on the upper right that there's this one little electron circulating around its orbit, right? And this orbit isn't like a real circle track. It's just the probability that that electron shows up in that region. And if you look at carbon, which is very commonly found in us, you'll see that there are two electrons in the first ring, and then there's four on the outside, so a total of 6. And these electrons, these outer valence electrons, what they call it, is able to interact to create bonds and to allow sharing between two elements. The electron orbits are where all the magic happens, right? These electrons swarm around that center nucleus, and they create these shells. They sometimes also call these energy levels. Energy shells, it's the same thing, but this is going to be different for different kinds of elements. The shells have a limited number of electrons that they can hold. The one closest, like I just showed you in the previous picture, you can have 2, and then the second one after that, you can have a maximum of 8, and then the next one, you can get up to 18. So this is the known elements. They don't exceed more than 7 electron orbits. That's what we are currently accepted. So here is a quick snapshot for the 5 elements that are most commonly present in organic molecules. And these are important because when you talk about the human body, macros, whether it be carbohydrates, proteins, lipids, nucleic acids, these are really the 5 relevant elements that we're going to talk about. And just, again, hydrogen, carbon, nitrogen, oxygen, sulfur, HCNOS, and on the right you see just a little bit about them. So not all of these 91 naturally occurring elements are all the same. There are ways that they can be uniquely modified, and they differ from one another because of the number of neutrons that they contain. So the weight of this is going to be different. And how they relate to AMP is that a lot of times in medical interventions, you can use radioactive versions of an isotope to use for either testing or for treatment. So for an example, one of the requirements for our bodies to make the thyroid hormone is an ion called iodine. Right? An iodine, which normally gets absorbed through the cellular membrane, is then modified, and you can make that into an unstable version of iodine called radioactive iodine, and then you can use that to treat and kill off the cell. So in some cases of cancer of the thyroid, or if you have a hyperthyroid issue, one approach is to treat the patient with the radioactive iodine, and that will bombard that tissue and cells and kill off some of the region. Bonding allows one element to share electrons with another element, and the atoms then are able to interact. And this is where, but whenever you have a molecule that's composed of 2 or more different elements, we call that a compound. So hydrogen, for example, has 1 electron, and it needs to fill the inner lane, so they forms this one single bond. And then carbon, again, has 6 and 2 on the inner and 4 on the outer valence, which I showed you in the picture earlier. The valence electrons are shared because they have this energy ability to overlap, and this is the first kind of bond we'll talk about called the covalent bond. This is formed when there's two atoms that are sharing them, and there are subclasses of them. We have one example called a single covalent. Single covalent is when you have a sharing of a single pair of electron, and you also can take that up a notch into a double covalent where you have a sharing of two pairs. But the difference between nonpolar and polar is that the nonpolar has the electrons, they're shared equally and evenly, whereas the polar one, they are actually shared unevenly. So there's a slight difference in charge for the polar covalent, which you see a lot in the human body, is that there's a slight dipole and difference in charge. And they express that with a sign like this called dipole. So one end of that bond is a little bit more positive and one end is a little bit more negative. So that creates a slight tug of war, right? And slight difference in how one part of that molecule is able to maybe interact with this part of the environment, and then the other part has a slightly different interaction. So here's just a picture, this cartoon image showing you the overlap where you have the core nucleus and then you have the electrons overlapping. Over here's some cartoon pictures of methane, ammonia, right? So you have different kinds of elements. You have the core with a nitrogen, and then you have hydrogen around it. But you can see that the electrons are being shared, and they form a structure. So sometimes you might have a region of that compound that tends to be more negatively charged, and one end that maybe becomes more positively charged. And that's a theme in the body. The theme in physiology is that there are gradients, there are chemicals, and there are charges. And all of those combined will allow your cells and then your systems to function the way they should. Water is our universal solvent, right? It's found all over the body. I told you guys a majority of this is found in your cytosol, 60%, and that remainder 40% is distributed in the outside ECF and ICF. It's a polar molecule. It dissolves most of the stuff except for lipids. It also forms very strong hydrogen bonds, so that's one of the most prevalent bonding you'll see in the human body because of the number of water molecules it has. So when you have a salt in water, it dissociates, and then the cation and the anion, the positive part of that and then the negative part of that, will then break up. The non-polar molecules don't dissolve, and these are hence called hydrophobic, right? So the term hydrophobic means fear of water, and then hydrophilic means you actually like and favor water. Picture of water, you can see that oxygen looks kind of like a reverse Mickey Mouse with the two H's on the bottom. And again, this is the dipole positive charge, dipole negative charge that I was telling you about. So there's this slight turning of charge in this gravitation where other water molecules, the oxygen will attract towards the hydrogen and so forth. And that bond by itself is very weak. It's a very weak attraction, right, between hydrogen and a slightly more negative oxygen. But because you have so much water and how many of these, then you form a pretty strong entity. We also have one kind of bond that is extremely, extremely important, which are ionic bonds. Ionic bonds have an attraction between a cation and an anion, a positive charge and a negative charge. For example, NaCl, right? The classic example. And because of all the water available, it dissociates, right? So NaCl is one compound together, but when you place it into a body of water, it dissociates into sodium ions and chloride. And what's significant about that? Well, when you dissociate these ions, they count for more items. Okay, so water plays a very important role in disrupting this in our body. So just a picture of showing you NaCl, sodium atom, and the chlorine atom, and then you can see that there's a difference in the charge. So positive means it's lost an electron, and then a negative means it gained an electron. A lot of these free ions are super, super critical. Even though they're so small in size, they are highly regulated inside your cell. So whenever you see anything that has a charge, whether it be magnesium, calcium, potassium, sodium, anything with a charge in your body, it's going to be controlled in how it goes into and out of the cell. It doesn't just penetrate without an entry of a specific protein channel. And if you were to disrupt that, then you can cause ionic imbalances. That could cause heart issues. That could cause your nerves to not properly fire. That could also suppress your CNS. As a matter of fact, one of the main ways to dull your central nervous system and to take away pain is to block ion channels on a neuron. One of the key themes is that because salts have the property to dissociate, they count for more items. So hydrogen bonds, we already talked about them, very weak by themselves. They're two polar molecules that have opposing charges. They're formed because of that electropositive H atoms, and they pull towards something that's negative. Usually it's oxygen or nitrogen. Because water is so prevalent, they may create something called surface tension. And this is mostly applicable in your respiratory system. So naturally, to combat this, our bodies will discharge this lipophilic protein, and that's a coating around the lungs called surfactant. Okay, and this is something you might see later on. Surfactant is this very important lipophilic protein, surfactant, that helps you reduce this water linkage because of hydrogen bonds, so that it keeps your airways opened up. There's also artificial versions of surfactant that can be given, and in some cases, when there's too much fluid buildup, you can also drain it out, drain the liquid.